it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink and listen. Sharprock. Like many young men, I found myself unsatisfied with the monotony of a normal existence. My heart thirsted for adventure as I floundered about the crowded and dirty streets of New York, nearly suffocating from the unrealistic expectations bestowed upon me by my peers. A recent graduate of Harvard, it was expected of me to find a place among society's elite. Over the past 250 years, my forebears had built the American academic prowess from the ground up. As the 19th century slowly gave way to the 20th, expectations to facilitate the continued growth of society flooded my waking hours. Before long, I found myself crushed beneath the mounting pressure and at my wits' end with educated society. The pompous attitudes and aristocratic demeanors drove me to the edge of my sanity. Resorting to ill-advised decisions at the tables and brothels, I longed for a reprieve from the poisonous lifestyle within which I found myself captive. Eventually, I allowed my emotions to steer my decisions, and that's why, in the matter of a few weeks, I found myself in the small mining town of Sharprock, thousands of miles from everything I'd ever known. The journey across the nation drained my pockets down to the pulp, but I'd never felt so full of energy in my entire life. Situated within the Rocky Mountains, Sharprock provided me with the freedom that I often feared I would never experience. The towering mountains juxtaposed with the beautiful prairies and sapphire blue lakes, capturing my heart upon first sight. My eyes ate up the gorgeous landscapes with a gluttonous fervor. However, my mouth was unable to follow suit, as I found myself going hungry within a few short weeks. The euphoric freedom was short-lived, as one can only truly appreciate the grand things in life when there's food in one's stomach. Lacking the requisite skills to survive among the vast wilderness and the hardened folk that it housed, I began to starve. Panic started to set in as I began to understand the dire circumstances of my situation. It felt as if my stomach began to eat itself, and after a few days without a morsel of food, I reverted to treachery. I began stealing from those that I knew could not do without, but at that moment in time my awareness for their well-being was buried so deep in my psyche, it may as well not even have existed. Desperation had grabbed the reins of my life, and I began to watch from the passenger seat as my existence began to veer heavily off course. In no grand length of time, I could hardly recognize myself. Covered in grime and emaciated, I felt myself longing for the stuffy atmosphere of New York City's intellectual circles. And trust me, that says more than I could ever hope to convey, as my disdain for the conceited academics coursed through every fiber of my body. Completely fed up with the enigma that had become my pitiful existence, I slung a rope over my bony shoulder and slowly made my way to the forest with a defeated gait. I do not believe it was a mystery to anyone in the town as to what I planned to do next. They had all seen it before. City folk like myself, biting off more than we can chew in the wild, lawless West. With my intentions as clear as day, the rope may as well have already been tied into a noose. I half wished someone would stop me from continuing with my plan, but everyone chose to watch my passing through the town and into the forest, instead of intervening. Everyone, that is, except for George. "Why, fellow, where are you off to?" asked a burly man. An obvious question, yet the look on the man's face showed that he already knew the answer. Stammering, I let out an incoherent concoction of noises, but my heart immediately leapt at the sound of his voice, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The idea of someone acknowledging my sorrows nearly brought me to tears. Overwhelmingly ashamed of my previous intentions, I began to sob. As I precipitated tears at a pace I would have previously deemed impossible, the man rose from his perch atop a rock and slowly sauntered his way over to me. If I'd seen this man in any other circumstance of my life, I would have been horrified of him, the way his brutish figure closed the gap between us. At this moment, however, I couldn't have been gladder to encounter his enormous self as he embraced me in a hug. I let the rope slip out of my hands as I reciprocated the hug, tears slowly saturating the man's vest. "I'm George. Everything's gonna be all right. What's your name?" he asked, his voice deeper than the greatest depths of the ocean. "Joseph," I managed to squeak out in between my sobs. "Well, Joseph, I'm certainly glad I found you. There's no coming back from where you were headed." After an indistinguishable amount of time, clutched tightly to the only person in 1,000 miles who cared, I found myself meandering my way through the forest, following George to his camp on the outskirts of Sharprock. After a short stroll through the woods, we arrived at the camp. Populated with hardened gunslingers and mischievous thieves, I felt like a fraud among the people of the camp. George introduced me to the band of misfits, and it was evident in their tone that I was not welcome. However, their obvious reverence towards George acted as a buffer between their unpredictable selves and myself. I greatly appreciated George not divulging my pitiful story to his crew, even though it was obvious that I was a charity case. The men, as removed from proper society as they were not stupid, and they knew a lost soul when they saw one. In fact, I would argue that their time spent struggling against the elements only proved to sharpen their intellect. George led me over to a tent, the likes of which looked as if it were pitched at the dawn of time. I was surprised the structure remained standing as George ripped the flap out of the way, revealing a man fast asleep. "Mort!" George bellowed, his voice burrowing itself deep into the earth. The man rose abruptly from his slumber, visibly startled as he drew his knife, breathing hard. "Your new cellmate," George said, beckoning to me. Mort fell back onto the bed, breathing a sigh of relief, as there was no immediate threat looming at the entrance of the tent. Sitting up again after a brief moment, Mort looked me up and down as if he were going to take a bet on how long it would be before I croaked. The scowl etched along the man's face said enough. "I suppose I can share, at least for a week until he dies." "If he dies, you join him," said George. "Oh, you and your lost puppies, George," Mort retorted with a slow shake of his head. George only glared at the man before ducking his head out of the tent and walking back over towards the center of camp. "Every time I think I miss society, I run into sorry fellows like yourself, and I'm reminded why I left in the first place." "It's a pleasure to meet you too," I grumbled. "You weren't born into this." "No, born and raised in Boston. Got out of there the first chance I could, though." "Ah, so you were once an esteemed member of society?" I asked, half-heartedly, as I began to prepare the cot with the blankets George had given me. "Hardly. More like I coexisted with society. I never felt a part of it, nor did I want to. Society was something that happened around me, never to me. Too many people like yourself running around." I grunted, having finally finished making the cot. I didn't feel obliged to respond any longer to Mort, his personality wearing me thin after just a few short moments. I exited the tent without another word, making my way over to the fire where George had elected to sit. The sun slowly dripped its way behind the horizon, bathing the previously blue sky in a bloody golden hue. I did not say anything as I sat down at the fire, but my disgruntled demeanor must have uttered more than words ever could. Don't let Mort bother you," said George. "He's no different to any of the newcomers. Always giving him a hard time, seeming to forget the hell that I pulled him from." "A real welcome party you folks offer," I mumbled. "But it's a better one than you would have received if you strung yourself up from that tree." Any welcome party's better than none, I suppose." "None? Well, I suppose it's up to what you believe in. Can't say I'm too surprised. You academics sure all think alike. What? You believe in an afterlife? You're surprised? Nope, just curious. Well, I'm not too sure what I believe in, but whatever it is, it doesn't end in death. When you've seen the things I've seen, there's no denying that. Out here, under the pale glow of the moon, all of your rules dissolve. There's no telling what horrors or secrets the moon will reveal, only that you'd be foolish to think so narrowly. I shivered, the creeping cold exacerbated by George's sentiment. If this place were as you thought, it'd be tame in comparison to its dark reality, George said. We sat in silence for a few moments, lost to our own thoughts. The sun had finally set, and I watched the shadows from the fire dance across George's face in a chaotic yet mesmerizing manner. Something about the man's face kept me locked in a blank stare. It may have been awkward had I not been completely lost in my thoughts. Something about the man's appearance seemed strange to me, alien even, but I just could not... Oh. Suddenly an audible gasp shattered my hazy concentration, my breath catching in the back of my throat. George sat there, seemingly unbothered by my reaction. He simply seemed used to the shock. Dangling from beneath his cap were 2 earlobes. Now, this would have been perfectly normal, had there not already been 2 ears below the earlobes. George had 4 ears. It took you long enough. Smart as you college lot are, you're not always the most observant bunch. George chuckled slightly. I truly didn't notice your oddities. I'm sorry, I said, looking downward. Sorry for what? Asked George. Well, I imagine growing up must not have been easy. School must have been dreadful. Growing up was not easy. With school, I never had the luxury of attending school. I don't know if I'd go as far as to call it a luxury, I said. You would if you found yourself facing the alternatives. You ever been to the circus? Yeah, once or twice. Then you'll know what someone with my, how did you put it? Oddities, yeah. Well, someone with my oddities is in high demand. All you need's a hat and no one would know any different. My mother knew different, and that's all that mattered. Plus, it's a little bit more difficult to hide this. He looked up, revealing 1 massive nostril, followed by him opening his hands, revealing 6 fingers on each hand. How had I not noticed any of this before? George looked as if he were the result of an inside joke among higher deities. He began to divulge the childhood hell that he'd experienced with the traveling circus. However, I do not feel I have the liberty to repeat this story. Well, not yet, anyway. George's past made even the most ludicrous of upbringings look docile in comparison. Over the course of the next few hours, I felt that I began to know George better than anyone I'd ever met. He'd seen me in my most vulnerable states, and felt that it was only right to even the scales. Over the course of the next few months, I slowly ingratiated myself into the collective that was George's gang. A gang that George never provided with a name, even at the behest of the crew. Now, any rival gangs aware of George's less-than-ideal history referred to our motley crew as the Traveling Circus, and the name had stuck well before I ever plopped my sorry ass with a lot of them. Whether the name bothered George, he would never say, but I can imagine it didn't sit well with him at first, especially after becoming privy to pieces of his story. Nevertheless, George was different from most men. While many people fall victim to their wretched histories, George had used his to fuel the fire burning deep within him. Regardless of his original feelings of the attempted slander, George now wore the distinction with a badge of honor, as did the crew. Never in my life had I met an individual who commanded so much respect, not just from his own crew, but many others spread throughout the plains and the mountains. Well, as a gifted intellectual myself, my less than fortunate parents pushed me into every scholarly circle they could find, leaving me with no choice but to obey, lest I receive the belt. Throughout my education, I found myself a part of countless intellectual societies, each void of any real and meaningful connection. I'd grown up to accept the fact that I would never truly belong to any collective, least of all an outlaw gang. Life, however, seems to have a peculiar way of delivering you to the things you desire the most. As outlandish a thought as this may have seemed earlier in my life, I consider myself blessed to have fallen into the enormous hands of George and his traveling circus, even if it ultimately led to my untimely demise. George stepped up to the roaring fire, situated at the center of the camp, wheeling Cole in tow. The rest of the gang, myself included, had already found our way beside the fire, the creeping freeze of winter slowly infringing upon the crisp fall air. Mort sat to my left, grumbling to himself incoherently as he fumbled with the elk meat roasting over the inferno. Courtesy of Mort and Lucas, the hunt earlier in the day had proved fruitful, the savory smell of the roasting meat wafting around our hungry selves in a devious taunt, as we all knew how long it took to cook the sinewy beast properly. An irritable man for sure, Mort almost made up for his lack of common decency with his uncanny ability to transform the wilderness around him into mouth-watering meals. The fear I'd come to associate with hunger during my initial inhabitance of the West slowly exorcised itself from my thoughts as I became more trusting of the steady food supply and more comfortable in sharing the table with the other folks. "News from the Union," said George, beckoning towards Cole, who scampered up behind him. Cole was a jumpy little fellow, born of the gold rush and raised in just about every saloon and brothel west of the Rockies. His mother came to the West with all the right intentions, but found herself selling her assets shortly thereafter. Cole was a product of her occupation and thus had never met his father. A quiet man at heart, the lack of any stability in his life only proved to exacerbate his personality, turning him into a full recluse. At the mercy of an unenvious lifestyle, Cole unearthed the secret to passing through life unheard and unseen, thus ripening his candidacy for an outlaw crew such as the traveling circus. No matter how much brawn, muscle, and determination the outlaw life boasted, the services of a quiet, non-threatening individual capable of eavesdropping on nearly all conversations was invaluable. "There was a battle earlier today, not far from here, no more than 10 miles south of Lucky," said Cole, partially stepping out of George's shadow created by the blaze. "Another massacre, I'm sure," replied Lucas, eyes still fixated on the roasting elk, a noticeable sadness in his tone. Half Sioux himself, Lucas held a deep resolve for the tribesfolk with whom he shared blood. "This was different," replied Cole. "I suppose, battle is the incorrect term. It was an ambush. A collective of Cheyenne and Arapaho attacked a supply train headed further west towards California." With a brief pause that may have been mistaken for dramatic purpose, were it someone else speaking, Cole continued. "A supply train led by none other than General McKeever." With this, the crew perked up, finally giving Cole the attention his passive disposition struggled to earn. "A McKeever?" asked Mort. "Filled with arrows," answered Cole. "Dead?" asked Jeb, seemingly unable to read between the lines. "Very," replied Cole. Widely regarded as the devil himself by the indigenous tribes, General McKeever earned himself a dastardly and feared reputation as the scorn of the natives. A ruthless tactician and brutal man, McKeever drew the ire of any good-natured folk throughout the nation, outlaws, academics, and natives alike. Unfortunately for the natives, McKeever's band lacked such individuals. "Serves that bastard right," said Lucas. "Hope it wasn't too quick." "Well, we should get a move on before the field's picked clean," said Jeb, rising to his feet. Even in my hunger, my stomach gave a quick twist as thoughts of sifting through the bloodied, mutilated dead flooded my mind. "We are no longer scavengers," George said, his voice rumbling authoritatively. Jeb sat back down tentatively, allowing George to continue. "But we are not going to let this opportunity pass us by either. Cole over here got wind of a funeral train returning the dead officers to the East Coast. A train that will be passing directly through Jordan's Cut." "Our territory," said Mort, thoughtful. "Aye," said George. "Where is this headed?" interjected Lucas. "Rob their coffins?" "Ransom," I responded, finally entering the conversation and believing I knew George's intention. "Aye, we hold the bodies for ransom," said George, a proud glint written across his face. The same look a father might give his son at the success of his son's first hunt. Lucas shook his head. "Those bodies will be cursed. If there's one thing I know about my ancestors, they would not let such men walk into the afterlife with ease. Don't interrupt the curse." "Cursed? How?" I asked, my thoughts reverting to my first extensive conversation with George. "Well, if this General McKeever was as hard as the stories make him out to be, I have my suspicions as to what they might do to him," replied Lucas. "Why should we have any concern for a curse placed on another man?" asked Mort. "Is it not uncommon for these curses to inflict collateral damage?" responded Lucas. "What are your suspicions?" I asked, ignoring Mort's input, my interest slowly encroaching upon my wariness. "Eternal damnation, except not the way Christianity would have you believe. General McKeever will never go to hell. Instead, they'll bring hell to him," Lucas said. My educated mind tried everything it could to ignore the implausibility of what Lucas was saying. However, my curiosity could not be satiated, my expression stating all that was required for Lucas to continue. "Well, I'm sure you're all aware of scalping. However, I doubt you're privy to its origins that differ greatly from the common understanding. An understanding rooted in the basic idea that a warrior or hunter is entitled to the trophies of its prey. Trophy collecting has transcended time and cultures alike, but more often than not, its inception hints at a darker beginning," said Lucas. "And the natives are no exception. Well, Christianity does not have a monopoly on its belief in hell, although the specific structure of eternal damnation varies across cultural lines. Instead of sending the soul deep into the depths of the earth, many of my forebears believe you could create hell within the body itself, trapping the soul within its own corpse to suffer for eternity. For those special individuals who earn a place amongst the truly evil, the removal of the scalp unlocks the canvas for which to create hell within the body. Once the ritual is complete, the reattachment of the scalp locks the soul within the newly crafted perdition. Over time, the practice of scalping changed as warriors collected the scalps of their enemies as a testament to their ferocity in battle, as the old ways provided no evidence. But even now, albeit a rare occurrence, some still revert to the ancient practice when deemed appropriate." After a long pause, gracefully allowing us to digest the entire story, Lucas added one last thing. "I repeat myself. Do not interrupt the curse. For our own good, let this opportunity slide." "Don't pay this any heed," interrupted Mort. "Cursed or no, those bodies will fetch us a pretty penny. It's not the first time we've ever been threatened with an Indian curse, and I very much doubt it'll be the last. Although I do not wish to ignore your concern, Lucas, I must stand with Mort. The benefits much outweigh the risks," said George. "I would worry more about stopping the rain. Out of everyone, I would have expected you to not brush this off so lightly, especially given your, less than ideal history," Lucas said to George, seemingly disappointed, even surprised. Now, if George had one flaw, it was his bullhead attitude towards danger. Granted, that stubborn, reckless, even dare I say foolish attitude was the reason he dug himself from that atrocity of a childhood. However, it had also thrown the gang into precarious situations more than once. Situations that, by the good graces of luck, we'd always escaped from. George, however, refused to acknowledge the luck involved, instead deeming it his right to walk away unscathed. And after what that man had been through and survived, who were we to blame him? Hell, we even began to believe him ourselves. But when you provoke danger for too long, it has no choice but to bite back. And bite back it did. We slowly made our way up to the bridge, methodically traversing the menacing path through the mountains. At long last we approached the bridge, the view from the cliffside expanding into oblivion. Far beneath us, fog drifted across the lake, the heavy mist only visible by the moon's glow peeking from behind the clouds. Silence enveloped the mountainous surroundings, our lanterns providing the only light save for the skeletal hue of the moon. We waited in anxious anticipation for the mechanical drone of the train in the distance, our breath crystallizing into swirling patterns before us. It never came. Even in the cold, my hands began to sweat the longer I waited. As the wait lengthened, my adrenaline slowly began to abandon me, leaving me cold, dark fear in its wake. What had I gotten myself into? Finally, a light appeared on the other end of the tracks, climbing its way through the winding mountain tracks towards the bridge. My heart exploded into a diabolic pace as my grip strangled my pistol. I could sense all the others stiffening as well at the sight of the light. Interestingly, no noise of the approaching train reached my ears. Well, I chalked that up to the thundering of my heart, as I could hardly even hear myself breathe. Looking about the group, however, it was evident that I was not the only one experiencing this uneasy feeling, but then again, robbing a train doesn't necessarily put your heart at ease. Once the train began to cross the bridge, George gave a slight nod to Mort. He began to mobilize the carriage. The goal was to time the blockade so that it stranded the train helplessly while crossing the bridge. I glanced at Mort as he began to push the carriage from behind the cover of the mountain towards the tracks. Now, as a band of outlaws, we were no strangers to committing heinous acts, robbing trains being the least of them. But not once since joining it had I ever seen the look that Mort returned to me. It was a look of pure vacillation. I'd never known a man more resolute in his decision-making than Mort, so seeing the reluctance etched across his face frightened me to my core. After a noticeable hesitation, Mort drew the carriage across the tracks at the end of the bridge and then climbed onto the roof, waving 2 lanterns. Paying no heed to the wagon blocking the tracks, the train continued barreling towards the blockade. In an attempt to further incentivize the halt of the train, Mort threw both lanterns at the wagon below him, igniting it instantly. Bearing down upon the inferno, the train still did not make any attempt to stop. At the last moment, Mort jumped from the burning wagon just as the train collided with the improvised bonfire, shattering the strange silence with an ear-splitting carnage. I hit the ground no different than I would have if I were one of those unfortunate souls on the field at Gettysburg. A fireball engulfed the front of the train as wooden splinters shot out like cannon fire. I lay there dazed and confused, the world seeming to move around me in slow motion. Next to me, Cole observed his chest with near fascination as a spear-like splinter of wagon jutted from his body. He looked at the wound as if it were not inflicted upon him, but upon someone else. In a pitiful look of confusion, he glanced at me before tumbling over, shoving the debris further into him. I grimaced, looking away. Suddenly, I felt my collar yanked upward. Turning, I saw George perched atop his horse like that of a war general. And he may as well have been, since it was evident that he declared war upon that blasted train. My horse stood beside him as he beckoned me to join him on his quest. Climbing atop the horse, George gave me no time for reprieve as he was already barreling alongside the train. In a moment entirely devoid of any thought, I chased after him in reckless abandon. The frigid, mountainous squalls tore at my face and lungs as the steed accelerated in frantic pursuit of both George and the runaway locomotive. With the train acting as a barrier between the luminescence of the moon and our frenzied chase, the dim glow hidden within each of the boxcars provided the only light for our pursuit. The inopportune darkness only fed the utter insanity of the chase, as I clenched my teeth in violent anticipation of the boulder that never came. And in yet another tale of George's invincibility, we clambered onto a slightly agape boxcar nearer to the back of the train. The fury and chaos from the preceding chase dissipated almost instantly as we pulled ourselves aboard the runaway behemoth. Small oil lamps hung along the damp wooden walls, providing a muggy illumination of the cargo stored within the boxcar. I began to wipe my eyes, only then starting to realize how much they'd watered while riding headfirst into the Highland gales. At any other point in my life, I would have welcomed the calmness that presided over the train. However, at this moment, something seemed amiss. Something was not right with this train. A quick glance at George next to me confirmed that the feelings were mutual. "We'll be across the country before long at this pace. Get up front and stop the train," George said, obviously doing his best to ignore his creeping reservations. Clearly having less of a grip on my own reservations, I grunted a pitiful acknowledgement, turning away and heading towards the locomotive. Methodically, I worked my way through the long queue of cars that led up to the head of the train. Each car resembled the last. Silent storage cars lined with oil lamps and filled to the brim with various cargo, and each car reverberated a clammy warmth in distinct contrast to the biting cold of the mountains outside. I gradually became aware of a trickling sweat, the source of which originated just above my brow. Each salty bead trickled slowly and ever so maddeningly down my face until their grip failed, tumbling off the crest of my chin, clearing the way for their counterparts. As unnerving as the calmness was, I could not help but appreciate the lack of a firefight that usually accompanied such an act. It was not every day you robbed an unguarded train. I considered myself lucky. And that was when I noticed it. The smell. At first, it was just the unpleasant smell of burnt hair that wafted towards me, but before long a much harsher, stronger, more potent smell reared its ugly head. Burnt flesh. The hair on the back of my neck stood on edge, emitting a chill down my spine. I felt my eyes slowly bulge out of my sockets and all my senses heighten as the adrenaline floodgates opened wide once again. To my surprise, the smell of smoke never joined the army of olfactory horror that had taken control of the train. Where had I smelled this before? Venturing deep into the archives of my brain, I dug around aimlessly until finally happening upon a rather unpleasant memory. Lacking the structure of a more robust memory, all I could see or smell was the small crematorium tucked away in the alley behind my parents' old apartment building. That, along with my curiosity as to why all those people on their little beds entered but would never leave. I remember my fascination as to how the building could hold so many people if no one ever left. The mind of a young boy remains innocent even when the answers are staring you directly in the face. Fake memory or no, the smell was unmistakably that of a crematorium. But why was there a crematorium on a... And then it hit me, and I genuinely wish it hadn't, because what followed has not left me since, nor will it ever. With a newfound sense of purpose, I continued my way through the last collection of cars leading towards the front of the train. In a few short minutes, the smell went from noticeable to nauseating. Hiding my nose beneath my shirt, I approached the furnace car, sure of what I was going to find. But no matter how hard you try, Nothing can prepare you for the sight of a half-charred corpse, especially if your corpse is actually 3 corpses. I staggered back, shirt still covering my nose, the intense heat reaching out at me, as if it were inviting me to join. The crackle of hot coals within became the only audible noise as I stood there trying to comprehend the situation. Unfortunately, the situation sat far outside the realm of comprehension. Each corpse lay next to the other, no different from soldiers in barracks, one next to the other, lying on their backs, arms to their sides. Had the skin not been melting off their bones, it would have been easy to mistake the unfortunate trio as asleep rather than dead. Better yet, the furnace showed no signs of struggle. It seemed as if the poor souls, with the absence of any proper bedding, had opted to take a nap in the cozy confines of the furnace. A nap they would certainly not awaken from, or so I hoped. My every thought grasped desperately at any semblance of reality, only for my grip to falter with each attempt. Maybe they'd died before being shoved into the furnace, I finally thought to myself, unsure of whether it was aloud or within my head. That seemed the only viable explanation. Standing ajar behind me, the door to the conductor's cabin begged for further investigation. I stepped into the cabin and, staring me in the face, was the slender, bronze lever that, if pulled, would bring the train to a screeching halt. It was then I finally remembered what had brought me to the front of the train in the first place. Without hesitation, I pulled the lever. Lurching forward at the sudden halt of momentum, I caught myself before bashing against the front of the cabin. Outside the window of the cockpit, I could see the sparks bursting up from the steel tracks, teeming with the shriek of the skidding stop. I could only hope George had braced himself for the sudden stop. Having stopped the train, I allowed myself once again to focus on the incredulity at hand. I surveyed the cabin with the hopes of finding even the smallest hint of struggle among the more obvious signs of foul play. To my increasing disbelief, everything seemed in order, and there were none of the telltale signs such as bullet casings, blood, or broken objects. Not allowing myself to believe the unbelievable, I became frantic in my search for evidence, only to find myself exasperated by the end of my effort. Feeling my sanity slipping with every passing second, I finally peeled myself from the foolhardy investigation and began to work my way back towards George, now that I'd finally stopped the train. I walked back through the train in a trance-like state, shaking uncontrollably, my feeble attempts to quell the tremors proving unsuccessful. At long last, the screech of the untimely halt of the train dwindled away, placated. Once again, silence slithered its way onto the train, save for the muffled howling of the wind. Further losing my grip on sanity with each step I took and each identical boxcar I entered and exited, I tried instead to focus once again on the near convulsions that vied for control over my body. Well, it may seem silly, but breathing patterns I once used to calm myself during my time at Harvard began to calm my nerves. A few boxcars later, I felt that I once again had control over my body. I continued to shiver and my fear still sickened me, but I felt that my leaking sanity had finally congealed. No matter how hard I tried, however, I could not rid my mind of the charred corpses, staring complacently at the molten ceiling of the furnace. I continued through a handful more boxcars until I came to the daunting realization that I couldn't tell which of the cars George and I had originally boarded. With each vacant car I walked through, that distant sense of panic crept its way back to the surface. I must have passed our original car 10 cars ago, I thought to myself. Where was George? I began to accelerate my pace with each empty car I passed through. I could feel panic unveiling its unwelcome presence once again, a lump forming in my throat and my mouth going dry. It seemed as if my palms stole all the moisture from my mouth, my hands again becoming clammy and my heart beating with rapid succession. A feeling of dread washed over me. the same dread that accompanies a small child lost in the woods. With each new boxcar absent of George, I felt myself growing increasingly frantic. Discipline faltering, my mind wandered to the forlorn corners of my conscience. I allowed my previously resolute demeanor to devolve into harrowing thoughts of George, convincing myself of his dreadful demise. Finally, as I pushed through the next door in my seemingly eternal queue of train cars, I saw the enormous figure of George squeeze through the door at the opposite end of the car. I called his name a moment too late as the door shut behind him. I began after him, my previous thoughts and fears about George falling by the wayside. I felt a little foolish that I doubted the man's ability to fend for himself. As I walked through the car, I could not help but notice that the cargo differed from other cars I'd passed through. I did not offer it much attention, with my focus glued to the door at the opposite end until it finally hit me. The boxes were coffins. This did not surprise me, as I was more than aware of the cargo housed within some of the boxcars, but it unsettled me nonetheless. I knew that just beneath each lid lay the mangled remains of some god-forsaken young man. Just the thought released a shiver down my spine. As I continued walking through the car, a small irregularity with one of the coffins caught my eye, dragging my attention away from the original objective once again. I'm still unsure of how my attention fell upon such a minute detail, but on the side of one of the coffins to my right was a small hole, just large enough to fit a finger. Lying beside the coffin were a few tiny splinters that must have come from the creation of the hole. I would never have noticed these splinters had I not first noticed the hole, as the splinters were hardly more than lonely scraps of sawdust. As hard as I tried to depress the morbid curiosity rising deep within me, I could not resist. The lid of the wooden coffin slid off with ease, tumbling to the floor with a muffled thud. Staring directly up at me was a relaxed yet blank stare of a young man. Ripped from my lungs, my breath surrendered itself to the surprise of seeing the young man stare. Obviously, I knew exactly what lay inside the coffin, but why would they leave his bloodshot eyes open to gaze endlessly upon the underside of the lid? I noticed another oddity. Blood caked the right side of the man's face and the inner wall of the coffin, the epicenter of which was the hole that originally caught my attention. Confusion and fear assaulted my thoughts in alternating waves. My first thought, admittedly drivel, was that the young man was buried alive and could not escape, thus killing himself. However, remembering the ease with which I'd removed the lid, that disproved that theory. Examining the unfortunate soul, I tried my best to distinguish his unit. However, his uniform differed from what I'd come to expect of the military. It seemed more humble, like burying the poor boy was a last-second decision. A decision made with the understanding that the soldier lacked the proper burial attire or posthumous attention. This man was not a soldier. He was one of the men assigned to guard the train and its cargo. I finally thought, dread ambushing my conscience in a fury. Suddenly an observation I'd subconsciously repressed emerged from the depths of my mind. The coffin seemed much deeper from the outside than it did while gazing upon the body it housed. The man, it seemed, floated on top of some entity within the coffin. An entity, I realized a moment later, in the form of another body. Moving entirely by instinct, I shoved the stiff corpse to the side of the coffin, revealing an older, much more decadent corpse beneath. This man was most certainly a soldier per his traditional funeral garb. His closed eyes resembled a peaceful slumber, while any mortal wounds the man had suffered remained hidden. I let go of the fresh corpse, allowing it to slump back on top of the soldier. To my ever-increasing terror, I noticed that the coffin surrounding me also bore similar holes to the coffin I'd examined. This is where the guards went, I thought. My thoughts rushed back to the furnace where it seemed the drivers of the train had willingly offered themselves up to the inferno housed within. No matter how fervently I tried to downplay the unbelievable events from the past 20 minutes, I could no longer feign disbelief at the obvious suicides. Suicides that seemed to have occurred without second thought. My academic mind finally reverted to hysteria as the preceding events and discoveries became too much to handle. I ran from coffin to coffin, ripping off the lids only to find that each coffin housed not only a properly groomed corpse, but a fresh, bloodied corpse stacked on top as well. The last semblance of sanity fell from my grasp, never to return. After an indistinguishable amount of time, I slowly stumbled out of the cabin, exhausted and disturbingly carefree, all ties to sanity mercifully severed. Leaving bloodied handprints on each door I'd pushed through, I resumed my odyssey through the train, an admittedly shell-shocked gait to my usually sure-footedness. I began to sweat once again, the salty beads dribbling down my chin and, well, these droplets were different, more viscous. I was not sweating, but drooling. Upon my realization, I simply let the saliva tumble from the barriers of my lips, the stringy viscosity undulating like that of a pendulum with each step. Peculiarly, my insanity did nothing to quell my awareness, only instead acting to dissolve my ability to read as would be deemed normal. Suddenly I reached the final car, directly before the caboose. Had I still contained the capacity for emotion, I may have emitted some surprise. I'd finally come to the passive acceptance that the forsaken locomotive stretched on for an eternity. However, the horror-scratched window peering out into the abyssal darkness spoke to another truth. A figure stood out on the caboose, gazing off into the distance, appearing to look at nothing in particular. A figure that could be none other than George. Had I forgotten about George? In my panic and eventual retreat from sanity, I begrudgingly realized that not only had I forgotten about the mission at hand, but also I hardly even remembered I was not alone. The groan of the wind masked the screech of the hinges as I pushed through the door leading out onto the caboose deck. Offering a slight acknowledgement of my presence, George nodded, his gaze still fixed upon the blackness beyond. Shrouded behind the seemingly random migrations of clouds, the moon found itself held captive by the ever-thickening mists. George's figure remained backlit by the small lamp hung just outside the door, further rendering any reliable view beyond the caboose impossible. I stood there for a long moment, in the quiet presence of my burly friend. Neither of us said anything, but despite the silence and the void that had replaced my sanity, I found it comfortable to find myself among the living once again. "Did you see him?" George asked. "See who?" I responded, finally wiping the drool from my chin. "The General," replied George. I don't believe so," I muttered in response, my mind scrambling back through the seemingly impossible memories. "Did you?" George took his time before answering, but the look in his eye as he turned to face me told me all I needed to know. "Aye," he managed to say. Now that he was facing me, I noticed that he carried what looked like a furry animal in the dim lighting. It was a few moments later that I actually realized what he held in his hands. It was a bloody tuft of hair. A scalp. "And I found this at the bottom of his coffin," he said, tossing the scalp towards me. I stood there, staring at the gnarled and bloody scalp, speechless. I slowly raised my gaze to meet George's once again, a moment of clarity materializing between the two of us. George gave a brief nod as if to acknowledge my thoughts. The reverberating rumble of the train crossing a bridge became audible as the train began to span a valley buried beneath the depths of the darkness below, yielding any guesses as to the bridge's height futile at best. To my eternal surprise, George said nothing else to further the conversation. He simply turned, looking at me with a blank expression, a complacent look plastered on his face. He looked at me, and I at him. I held his gaze, trying to decipher his bizarre demeanor, but his expression was airtight. "George?" I asked feebly, worried for what might follow. For the briefest of moments, a hint of reservation crossed his docile expression, only to return almost instantaneously to his previous disposition. George no longer looked to be in control of himself, in spite of his legendary resolve. Without further hesitation, George cast himself from the caboose, the complacency never leaving his face, as his would-be corpse fell rigidly, almost peacefully, into the night. Well, I was more than aware that I should have felt stunned at the unprovoked suicide of my savior, but I couldn't muster the surprise, or any emotion for that matter. Instead, I just stood there, staring out at the expanse as George had done moments before. Slowly, one emotion crept its way from the cavern of my existence. Curiosity. There's something about these old Wild West tales that just really appeals to me. They're just drenched in atmosphere, and they're an absolute joy for me to read. Did you enjoy that one? I loved it. Thought it was great. Well, your thoughts, feelings, and anything else you want to write in the comments section below the video, please, and I will do my best, as ever, to reply to as many as I can. Well, quite a Wednesday, wasn't it? Back again soon? Do you want me back? Go on, tell me you do. Of course you do. Well, until next time, my dear friends, that's enough from me. But very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.